and Timothy Pickering being appointed sole agent for that purpose, and the agent having met and conferred with the sachems, chiefs, and warriors of the Six Nations in a general council. Now, in order to establish the good design of this conference, the parties have agreed on the following articles, which, when ratified by the President, with the advice and consent of the Senate of the United States, shall be binding on them and the Six Nations. Article 1, peace and friendship are hereby firmly established and shall be perpetual between the United States and the Six Nations. And it goes on to describe how the lands of the Six Nations will be held inviolate and in respect by the federal government. One sentence from Article 3. Now the United States acknowledge all the land, and I should point out the word acknowledge is in the singular. The United States, a collection of states, not as a single entity in the mindset of that era. The United States acknowledge all the land within the aforementioned boundaries to be the property of the Seneca Nation, and the United States will never claim the same, nor disturb the Seneca Nation or any of the Six Nations, or of their Indian friends residing thereon and united with them in the free use and enjoyment thereof. But it shall remain theirs until they choose to sell the same to the people of the United States who have the right to purchase. The Canandaigua Treaty has often been considered to be the oldest American treaty unbroken. But that concept came into great question in the late 1950s when there was the federal government who wanted some of the Seneca reservation land to dam up the Allegheny River for the Canandaigua Dam. And the federal government took quite a lot of acreage for that. And despite protests in the 1950s based on the Canandaigua Treaty, that dam was constructed. Now, many of you knew my father, J. Sheldon Fisher, who was a longtime activist on many historical causes. He learned that the Seneca Nation was never compensated for that land taken for the Canandaigua Dam. But as luck would have it, he had a cousin named Kenneth B. Keating, who happened to be a U.S. Senator at the time. And Dad contacted Senator Keating, explained the situation, and Senator Keating established legislation signed by the President to provide a compensation. As I recall, it was $15 million, but that's more than had been presented before. A little short. Well, now the Canandaigua Treaty says that you'll get $4,500 annually. They didn't understand the concept of inflation in 1794. Congress neither. So when Dad began these annual commemorations of the Canandaigua Treaty, the Senecas, on the very first of these in 1964, adopted Senator Keating as an honorary Seneca. And as kind of a surprise, my father was also adopted as a Seneca at that same time. As was pointed out, very few Native Americans came to these initial commemorations, basically because they felt that the treaty did not have the honor and respect from the United States government that it should be having. But gradually, particularly after this inadequate compensation, attitudes began to change, and it became clear that these commemorations were a great way to remind everybody of how important it was to respect the Native American rights. And we also saw in society in general a discrediting of the Hollywood stereotypes of the Native Americans and a greater sensitivity. And so over the next decade or so, attendance here increased greatly at these commemorations. The largest we ever had was on the bicentennial in 1994. 5,000 people came here with written greetings from the President of the United States. So we have a great tradition established here, and I think it's particularly wonderful to have the President of the Seneca Nation meeting in friendship with an elected federal representative and everybody coming together in peace and friendship. Thank you very much.
I see in the audience a friend of mine that I want to ask to come up. Helen, if you would come up. The Quakers, for some time, have taken a position of listening to and attempting to help where they could the Six Nations. And we have a journal that was put together by a man named William Savory. William Savory was one of those translators who was here to read the document as it was being written, to inform the Seneca whether or not this conformed with the words that they were hearing the representatives speak. And so that's an early example of the Quakers' involvement. A later involvement will be in the Compromise Treaty of 1842 over the Buffalo Creek Territory. And just this past Wednesday, they moved the Quaker Meeting House that was erected in 1816 to a location where it will be preserved. And they also thought back to that time period when the Quakers were again assisting the Six Nations people in 1842. Helen, would you offer some words, please?
My name is Helen Kirker, and I bring you greetings from your neighbors, the Farmington Friends, known as the Quakers. Our Society of Friends was involved here in Canandaigua in 1794, when the Native Americans and white settlers were each quite leery of each other. Both sides of the treaty negotiations thought that the other side was trying to take advantage of them. This was particularly an issue where the treaty was to be written in English, but where each Native American nation had its own language. The participants needed a neutral party, one that all sides could trust. That mediation role fell to the Society of Friends, who sent a delegation here from its headquarters in Philadelphia. With the Quakers helping to establish a mutual trust, the treaty negotiations were able to proceed on the subjects at hand. William Savory led this Quaker delegation from Philadelphia. The journal that he wrote then contains our most detailed account of what happened here in Canandaigua that summer and autumn of 1794. My own Quaker ancestors were from North Adams, Massachusetts, and joined many of their neighbors to come to Ontario County in 1788 to settle what is now Farmington, New York. Their North Adams neighbors disapproved of that move and read them out of the Quaker meeting. In 1794, however, some of those North Adams neighbors came to Canandaigua as part of the Quaker contingent. While here, they visited their former neighbors in Farmington and saw that they had made a nice settlement. So all was forgiven, and they were readmitted to the Society of Friends. North Adams, Massachusetts was later the birthplace of another Quaker woman named Susan B. Anthony. Her 1873 trial in this very courthouse was a landmark in the history of women's suffrage. Prior to that trial, Susan traveled throughout Ontario County in an effort to sway public opinion to her cause. Several times she visited Farmington and spoke to her fellow Quakers there. Farmington in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s was a hotbed of social ferment. The 1816 Farmington Quaker Meeting House hosted a forum on women's rights in 1838, which declared that all men and women are equal. This was a full 10 years before the more famous Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls. Abolition of slavery was then a leading issue, and many Farmington Quakers assisted slaves in escaping to Canada on the Underground Railroad. Even though assisting the escape of slaves was then illegal, the neighbors were sympathetic and would not tell on those who harbored slaves overnight on their road to freedom. Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and many other famous abolitionists found a receptive audience in the 1816 Farmington Quaker Meeting House. In 1838, the Senecas were remorseful and resentful at being taken advantage of in the infamous Buffalo Creek Treaty, which purported to deprive the Seneca of their land in New York State and force them out of the state. A delegation of Senecas visited the 1816 Farmington Quaker Meeting House asking for help. They knew that if anyone would help them, the Quakers would, and they were right. Farmington and Philadelphia Quakers launched an intensive public relations and lobbying campaign and succeeded in overturning that treaty. That is why the Senecas were not ousted on a trail of tears in the 1840s and have been able to remain in New York State through today. This campaign on behalf of the Senecas was extensively documented at the time in minutes and notes now maintained in the Quaker collection at Swarthmore College. Copies of these papers have been made and placed on deposit at the Canandaigua State Historic Site in Victor. The landmark building that hosted all this important dialogue was almost completely neglected in recent years and was headed for imminent collapse if it were not torn down first. That almost happened. In 2004, when I was clerk of today's Farmington meeting, Douglas Fisher came to me to see what we could do to save this important building, and we set to work. It was a daunting task that very few thought could succeed, but our effort accelerated, even despite a windstorm blowing off a full wall. Hundreds of thousands of dollars have since been raised by a very active committee, and the new Farmington Historic Quaker District has been created on the National Register of Historic Places. Just this week, the stabilized 1816 building was moved 1,600 feet to its new permanent location on Sheldon Road in Farmington, where it will be restored to its period of significance in the 1830s and 1840s. Peter Jemison gave a Seneca blessing at our ceremony this Wednesday in celebration of the completion of the building's move as an echo of his Seneca Nation ancestors, speaking there 170 years ago. Had Douglas Fisher and I not acted 7 years ago to save this important building, it would not exist today. Now we can depict in the 21st century all the American history that happened within its original four walls back in the early 19th century. With our extensive documentation, future visitors will be able to hear the authentic words spoken by Frederick Douglass within the very walls where they were once uttered by him. Speeches of early suffragettes will be read within the very walls where they once resounded. And the words of the 1840s Senecas will be heard there in the 21st century as modern visitors seek to understand the issues confronting Native Americans in New York 150 years ago. We have a website at www.farmingtonmeetinghouse.org where everyone can monitor the progress of this most worthy project. Thank you all for attending today.
Over the last few years, we have had representatives come from the Indian Defense League of North America and Indian Defense League of America, I should say. And today we have a representative, a young woman by the name of Christina Hill. She's a member of the Upper Mohawk Turtle Clan of the Six Nations Reserve in the Grand River. And I'm going to let her just speak as a representative for the Indian Defense League. They continue to host and promote the border crossing, which takes place annually in Niagara Falls. 1 year crossing from the U.S., the next year crossing from the Shawinigan Canadian side.